In a small town in the hills of Spain's wine country, you can find an ancient monastery. 1,000 years ago, deep in its halls, its monks did something seemingly ordinary that would alter the course of history forever. While studying scripture in medieval Latin manuscripts, the monks of this monastery scribbled some notes in the margins to help them make sense of the text they were reading. In the margins of these manuscripts, they wrote in a language they spoke in everyday life, something that was starting to look different from the Latin they were reading. The monks could not have known that the notes they were writing would later be regarded as the first writing in the Spanish language. Fasten your seatbelts and hit those like and subscribe buttons, because we're asking the question, how many languages are there in the world? Welcome to Learnabit. In today's episode, we're starting with a seemingly simple question. How many languages are there in the world today? And to do this, we'll need to talk a little bit about two things: how languages evolve over time, and the many problems with counting the number of languages and language families in the world. Well, at first the answer would seem pretty straightforward. Just go around and count the number of languages, right? Well, linguists think the number of languages is somewhere around 7,000, but try to get a more exact number than that and you're actually going to struggle a lot. The Ethnologue, a resource that keeps track of the various languages of the world, lists 7,117. Other sources, however, might say a number closer to 6,500. There's a lot of variation in these answers. You might be surprised to learn that only a small part of the counting problem comes from undiscovered languages like those spoken by the tribes in the Amazon. A lot of the problem actually comes from that unit of measurement. Like, what exactly is a language? I touched on it a little bit in my Languages of Spain video, and it's a topic that I definitely want to do a whole video on in the future. However, for this video, we'll be exploring how the natural evolution of languages makes counting the exact number of languages challenging, if not impossible. Language is fluid and ever-changing. New words come into a language all the time, and old ones go out of fashion. New ways of speaking and writing become popular, and old grammar begins to feel archaic and inorganic. Languages and their speakers constantly come into contact with one another, and writers must find new ways to express new ideas. So, it's not really surprising that eventually a language will no longer look or sound like it once did. Just try reading Beowulf or Chaucer in what was once English. It's incredibly difficult. Even writers like Shakespeare or Dickens, who both wrote in what is considered modern English, often sound strange and confusing to us today. But that begs the question, at what point does one parent language spawn a new language? At what point did Latin turn into Spanish and the other Romance languages? Well, truthfully, the answer is that there isn't really one definite point where one language becomes another. But there will likely come a time when, like the monks in the beginning of this video, a reader can no longer really understand what's being said, and may even have to translate it. And this is an important concept that I've touched on before in my videos called mutual intelligibility, which is basically the amount that two speakers can understand one another. If both speakers can understand the other with relative ease, many linguists would probably say that they're speaking the same language. But if they can't understand one another, many linguists might likewise say that they are not speaking the same language. So, perhaps this is where one language ends and the next begins? Well, there are some problems with using mutual intelligibility to determine whether two varieties of speech are one language or two. A lot of English speakers sometimes struggle to understand different accents, for instance, but we still think of it all as English. So let's stick with the Romance languages as our example and clear some of this up. Around the time that those monks in Spain were arguably vandalizing the first written Spanish into books, dozens of other places around Europe that once spoke Latin were realizing that they didn't exactly understand Latin either. and nor could they understand one another at times. Now, there weren't very clear linguistic boundaries that marked where one language stopped and another began. As with many forms of language change, the process was gradual and happened slowly all over the former Roman Empire over hundreds of years. For example, in casual everyday speech, people in City A might have slowly begun to pronounce a particular consonant or vowel slightly differently from the way the people in City B pronounced it. Or a certain word or expression might have gone out of fashion in City B, and they substituted it for a different word. City C and D, and so on, would each also have made their own slight changes to the way they spoke Latin over the centuries. Now, this leads to a bit of a linguistic conundrum. City A and City B could understand each other's dialects without too much difficulty in a situation where we might say the languages are mutually intelligible. Since there was mutual intelligibility, linguists would likely say that they spoke similar variants of the same language. City B and City C could understand each other's dialects, so they must speak the same language. And City C and City D can understand one another, so they must be speaking the same language. However, in the case of the Romance languages, this chain of ever so slightly different dialects was not just 4 cities long. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers, from Portugal in the west all the way to Romania in the east. The language variety would change so dramatically over these vast distances, for example, that speakers in City A could not understand speakers in City C or City D and vice versa. Logically, one would come to believe that they speak a different language from each other. But the towns in between A and D can understand their own neighbors well enough, so where exactly does one language end and the next begin? Welcome to the fascinating and sometimes frustrating phenomenon known as a dialect continuum. Arabic, for example, is probably the best known dialect continuum, in which some of its spoken varieties are quite distinct from one another, perhaps even enough for some to be considered their own languages. A Moroccan speaker might have a relatively easy time communicating with an Algerian, but a very difficult, if not basically impossible time with an Iraqi speaker. Think Spanish and Italian, or even Spanish and French. You'll get some of it, but not all of it. But there are very few clear linguistic boundaries or cutoffs in mutual intelligibility between different places. So it's hard to separate them into distinct languages. Hopefully, I'll be making a video on dialect continua in the future, but suffice it to say that they and other strange ways people define the term language are among some of the reasons why pinpointing an exact number of languages in the world is so difficult. So, in summary, we can safely say that there are around 7,000 languages in the world today, although this number is rapidly decreasing due to the growth of many larger world languages. But the honest answer is that the number depends on who you ask, and that whether a person considers something a language or not is often arbitrary. When asked whether Yiddish was a language or merely an eccentric dialect of German, sociolinguist Max Weinreich famously replied, "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." Hopefully, as this video has illustrated, the boundary between language and dialect is often an arbitrary one. Is Arabic one language or several? How about Hindi and Urdu? Are they separate languages or just dialects of the same language? The same question can be asked of Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, and Montenegrin. Are they all separate languages? Or just one? Now, these 3 examples I just listed are actually incredibly hot-button issues to many people, because language is something that is very personal and central to a person's identity. Now, I hope you all enjoyed that video, and if you did, please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel for more content in the future. If you have any video topics you'd like me to explore in further detail, or you have any thoughts on the video, let me know down in the comments. This has been Learnabit, and thank you for watching.